Hey, greetings everyone. Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. We are now depending on how you look at it, we're pretty much caught up. There's a little bit. So what I wanted to do next was wanted to look at something else that's found in the Paragon's collection. So it's technically a short story, although this one is it's pretty long. I'd say it's closer to novella length. So we're actually going to break it down and do it chapter by chapter. And we're not going to do the whole thing all in one go because it does talk a lot about the blood elves, which don't technically exist yet in where we're at with the games. But the first couple chapters of this short story do. So the first chapter that we're going to read now on this episode is it's dealing with the past. So this is again technically catch up, and then after this after we do these first couple chapters, there's one other thing that I wanted to do, which is going to take us a few episodes to catch up on, and then we'll finally be back up lore wise to where we can start doing Warcraft 3 again. On the last episode, we did finish up a small series of short stories. It was, I think it was kind of a recap of the War of the Shifting Sands, where we talked about that scepter that was needed when they opened up that raid back in Classic. So it was sort of the history of that. So for the most part, it was all in the past, 1,000 years before the Dark Portal. Before the Dark Portal opened. But with the present things happening technically toward the end of the Classic expansion. So here we have some cool pictures of what I believe will probably become blood elves, but these might be high elves. It's hard to tell in black and white, but you have obviously some kind of mage right there. You have a two-handed sword wielder, I guess maybe like a paladin, could be a warrior. You have another mage type figure right there. Again, it's hard to say exactly. And then this guy with the neat hat, also with a magical staff. So this is called Blood of the Highborne. It's by Mickey Nielsen. I think the last one we read was by Mickey Nielsen also. So he's done a few of these. We're just going to read the first chapter on this one. So stay a while and listen to chapter 1 of Blood of the Highborne, called All or None. Mercifully, the delirium passed. Even as her senses returned, the horrors Liadrin had witnessed were still fresh in her mind. She shook off the after effects, opened her eyes, and took in her inverted surroundings. The smoke had cleared. Flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows across the carved stone walls. Giant wooden masks mounted over stone-tipped spears scowled down disapprovingly. Crude effigies of various dark primitive animal gods maintained a silent and somber vigil. At least the room had returned to its normal state. The enclosed space was circular, with a ring of steps in the center descending to a small round floor. Grooves in this floor spread outward like wheel spokes from a depressed hub to drainage holes at the edges. Liadrin noted with extreme discomfort that the floor and grooves were stained a dark crimson. Above the depression, a large hook dangled from the ceiling on a rusty chain. Her eyes fell to the shallow copper brazier lying on the floor a few feet away. Inside, a few embers still glowed faintly. Somewhere along the wall to her right side, Darkhan roused with a start. She turned her head to see him struggling against the rope restraints, but it was no use. The mage was still far too weak. His face was flushed from the blood rushing to his head. Veins stood out on his temples, and his long hair brushed the floor. He looked around frantically for a moment, and then let out a long sigh. He looked over at Liadrin. I was trapped in some kind of terrible dream. As was I, Liadrin answered. I wakened only seconds before you. Darkhan struggled once more, but to no avail. I was not meant to die this way, he muttered. Trussed up like some animal. We were not meant to die this way, Liadrin countered. I do not like all this talk of dying. It was the voice of Galel. Leandrin turned her head to her opposite side where the young priest hung suspended. I wondered if one of those in the picture was a priest. She wondered how long ago he had regained lucidity. He continued almost casually. "The two of you speak as if you have already given up. I, for one, intend to find a way out of this predicament." Darkhan let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Ha, to be young and blissfully ignorant. Ignorant. I am not the one who led us into an ambush. It was your careless fumbling that no doubt alerted the savages to our presence. At least I was not the first to be knocked unconscious. No, that would require actually fighting. You priests are, after all, ill-suited for the rigors of combat." "Our role," Leandrin interjected, "is to preserve life and illuminate our comrades in the splendor of the light. It is far easier to draw blood than to staunch it, and when you lie battered and dying on the battlefield, you will thank the Sunwell for our talents." So that makes me think, A, these are blood elves because of the Sunwell comment, and B, she's not wrong. It's easier to do DPS than heals. Darkhan prepared to retort as Leandrin continued. "But by all means, we should go on arguing. Drawing attention to ourselves will likely ensure that they return and rob us of our senses again." Aside from Darkhan's indignant huff of a response, silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the torches. Leandrin tried for some movement, anything, if even just the wiggling of a finger. But the bonds held her hands tight against her back, and the rest of her body remained unresponsive. The only sensation she could feel was the searing pain of the ropes that bound her ankles. Galel spoke in a quiet tone. "Why do you suppose they have not tried to kill us yet?" "I do not know, Galel," Leandrin answered, but in truth she had some idea. She had heard stories of gruesome troll rituals, stories her young counterpart had most likely not heard, and none of them ended well. She was quite sure that whatever the moss-skinned monsters had in store for them, it would be extremely unpleasant. She turned to look at Darkhan, who had closed his eyes as if in meditation. That was good. Perhaps the effects were wearing off. Leandrin herself felt that she was slowly regaining the ability to focus. She closed her own eyes and searched with all her being for the glory of the light, but it still remained just beyond her reach. She wondered if their absence had been noted. If so, perhaps the forest riders had mounted a search. Perhaps they were gathering an army even now. She chastised herself for not demanding a more heavily armed escort when they had ventured out to investigate the defective runestone. She would have done more to protect her young apprentice. Galel, despite his bravado, was not yet wise to the ways of the world. Okay, if that's the case, now I'm starting to feel like maybe these are high elves, not blood elves, and this could be either of the Great Wars, but it might be Warcraft 3. But it had been several months since the last attack on an elven village, and Leandrin had felt safe with the handful of archers who led them. Of course, those archers had fallen quickly before the trolls, who had sprung upon them seemingly from nowhere. It would also make sense about the priests, because that is one of the main elven priests are a big part of Warcraft 3. They had attacked from the trees, where they had no doubt been hiding. Had they rendered the runestone inert, or had they simply discovered it and waited, knowing that someone would arrive eventually to investigate? If they had gained the ability to sabotage the runestones, she heard faint footsteps just then beyond the wooden door directly opposite her. There was a shifting of metal and a creak as the door swung open. Hideous creature, Leandrin thought as the troll entered. After all, she had more of a right to hate the trolls than most of her people. It was due to these beasts that she had lost her mother and father in one of the troll's many brutal raids. This particular troll propped one end of a wooden pole over his bony shoulder. His wiry, lanky frame fit through the door with ease, but his height was such that the thin strip of hair atop his head and the tips of his long pointed ears brushed the top of the entranceway. He wore the primitive tribal garb of the Amani, which amounted to little more than a loincloth, feathers, beads, and various leather accoutrements. Dangling from a rope belt on either side of his waist were two lightweight throwing axes. He looked at the trio and grinned. dark lips curling back from pointed teeth and long yellow tusks that thrust upward from his mandible. He took a few steps in and angled right to allow for the entrance of another. This one looked much like his counterpart, save for the fact that his tusks swept downward and flared out to the sides. Hanging upside down from the wooden pole they carried on their shoulders was a fellow elf, a ranger, and also a highly ranked far strider, judging by his light armor. He tucked his chin to his chest to avoid scraping his head on the floor. The trolls began to argue in their peculiar language, only snippets of which Liadrin caught. The first troll nodded his head toward the wall, where she and the others were hanging. The second pointed toward the hook dangling over the center of the room.
Do not argue on my account. The two of you are getting along so beautifully,
the ranger offered. Even as he said this, he looked about the room, taking in every detail, assessing the situation. His eyes met Liadrin's, and he offered her a brief, sympathetic smile. The first troll looked down at the ranger, then up at his companion, and shrugged his shoulders. They carried him down the steps to the center of the floor and hoisted him up, catching the ropes binding his ankles, onto the hook. The second troll pulled out the wooden pole.
In a matter of moments, this little hideaway of yours will be overrun, the ranger said to the trolls. If you let all of us go now, perhaps we will grant you some measure of mercy.
The second troll pulled back his leg and kicked the ranger solidly in the head. The first troll laughed, a deep, throaty chortle that made Liadrin shudder. There was movement at the door. Both trolls froze, and then they backed away as a third entered the room. This one leaned on a staff topped with a shrunken elven head. Misshapen skulls leered from atop wooden staves jutting from his back. Pouches, wards, and strange-looking fetishes hung from his belt. His face bore the wrinkles of advanced age, but the gleaming eyes that stared out from under the prominent brow were disturbingly keen. Darkhan lamented.
Oh, not this again.
The old witch doctor made his way around the center circle to the brazier on the floor. The other two trolls exited hastily as the witch doctor dug into a pouch, produced several green leaves, and dropped them into the brazier.
What is he doing?
The ranger asked.
Pacifying us,
Liadrin answered. The witch doctor carefully piled kindling beneath the brazier and laid one end of a 6-inch-long rope beneath it. He leaned down and spoke a single word.
Dazduga.
Liadrin assumed this word meant fire, because as before, the end of the rope lying away from the kindling caught flame. The old witch doctor chuckled as he turned and shuffled back around the circle and out of the room. The other two trolls quickly shut the door behind them and locked it from the outside.
We do not have much time,
Liadrin informed the ranger as the rope began its slow burn toward the kindling.
My name is Lorthamar Theron,
the ranger said quickly.
I am a lieutenant of the Far Striders. Our 3-man party was overcome. We sent a score of the monsters to their ancestors before I was struck by one of their bottled potions. When I awoke, my comrades were dead, and I was as you see me now.
Galel asked,
Is it true what you said before, about others coming to our aid? Unfortunately, no. It was an empty boast, but under the circumstances,
his eyes fell to the burning rope.
I felt it worth a try.
Darkhan spoke.
Do you have any idea what they plan to do with us?
Lorthamar tried to turn his head far enough to see the mage, but was unable to do so.
No, but as I was let in, it seemed they were busily preparing for someone's arrival.
A quarter of the rope's length was now all that remained before the kindling. Liadrin turned her head to Darkhan.
Have you regained your strength?
Darkhan attempted to concentrate. Liadrin and the others felt the slightest tug, not on their bodies, but from deep within. The sensation lasted for a few brief seconds and was gone. Darkhan shook his head.
Not yet.
The fire was a hair's breadth from the kindling. Lorthamar spoke urgently.
We may still survive this, but to do so we must all work together. When the opportunity presents itself, I will make my move. The rest of you must try your best to do the same. When that time comes, do not hesitate. I pledge to you now that no matter what happens, if I am able to free myself, I will not leave any of you behind.
The kindling caught fire. Lorthamar continued.
We are together in this, and whether we survive or perish, we will do so as one.
The brazier grew hot. Thick black smoke drifted up from the leaves, billowing, climbing, and spreading across the ceiling. Within seconds, cloudy tendrils groped downward. Lorthamar finished.
This is my pledge to you. All or none.
Liadrin watched the smoke consume her feet and then her legs, steadily progressing down her body.
Agreed. All or none.
Galel concurred, and amazingly his voice conveyed that same composure, the same confidence as before.
All or none.
Darkan's eyes were wide as the smoke engulfed his torso.
Yes, all or none.
The room turned dark. Liadrin closed her eyes, the sounds around her now muffled, distorted. She held her breath for as long as she could until panic set in and she gasped for air. The acrid smoke burned as it filled her lungs. There was an immediate sense of separation, as if her mind and spirit had disconnected from her body, lost and wandering in the dense black fog. She was vaguely aware of her eyes opening. The smoke retreated to the edges of the room, swirling and churning like a living thundercloud. Lorthamar trembled slightly at first, then convulsed violently. Foam flew from his mouth as he writhed and twitched like a fish on a hook. A voice carried throughout the enclosed space. A hoarse, raspy troll's voice. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, filling the chamber and moving eerily throughout the room.
The light not gonna save you now.
There was a creaking sound from behind the smoke on either side. Two of the wood masks shot out and floated in the still air.
You've been judged, and you've been found guilty.
The mask's features contorted as each echoed the voice's sentiment.
Guilty. Guilty.
She turned to see Darkan, whose eyes had turned pure white. He was smiling, laughing, a sound far more chilling to her than if he had screamed. She looked to Galel, who stared directly back at her with a mixed expression of shock and relief.
Sometimes it sounds like children screaming, he said. Hundreds of them.
A large chunk of his skull fell onto the floor. A steady stream of blood flowed from the gaping hole in his head, splashing onto the stonework. Liadrin turned away. Lorthamar was howling in agony. She watched in horror as his body burst into flame. The two masks were closer now, scowling down at her with malicious condemnation.
Guilty! Guilty!
Darkan continued laughing. Liadrin looked over. His skin had turned gray and begun to peel off. Small pieces near his mouth had been eaten away to reveal a bloody, grinning, predatory maw. A bloated insect exited one nostril and skittered across his face. Bones began bursting through his flesh. Liadrin shut her eyes tight. It is not real. It is not real. It is not real. The voice continued.
You've been found guilty.
Liadrin opened her eyes. The masks were gone. She was completely unaware of how much time had passed. Is it over, she thought, or is this another trick of my mind? The smoky veil parted to reveal a troll squatting down in front of her. He wore an open leather vest. The lower half of his face was wrapped in a long cloth. His eyes widened and twin jets of flame shot out. I guess the effects have not worn off yet after all.
You'll be guilty. Guilty of driving us out our own land.
Two weathered trolls sat on either side of Lorthamar, their lower faces wrapped as well. The one behind Lorthamar bore a scar across his forehead. Lorthamar was thankfully not on fire, though he still twitched and convulsed, his eyes shut tight as he fought through his own horrific visions. The trolls pounded their spears on the stone floor.
Guilty! Guilty! Guilty of making us hide like animals. Guilty of killing me brothers and sisters. Guilty of thinking you're everything around you. Guilty of being foolish enough to think you're gonna succeed where the others failed.
The troll paused for a moment, studying her. His eyes were bright as a chuckle rumbled deep in his throat. She immediately assumed this was Zuljin. She had heard stories of the fearsome troll leader who staged brazen raids against even the most heavily guarded elven villages. Somehow he always managed to infiltrate their defenses, and somehow he always managed to inflict damage and casualties and escape with his own life intact. He had grown infamous for his ruthlessness and cunning.
The Akia tried to make our ancestors go away. The night elves tried to make us go away. Then you tried to make us go away, but
he leaned close, twisting his head from side to side.
We be like a bad dream.
Liadrin blinked, and suddenly Zul'Jin's scarf was a massive constrictor, coiling around the leader's neck and face.
That just won't go away.
The snake lifted its giant head and opened wide to reveal row after row of needle-point teeth. Liadrin blinked once again, and the snake was gone, replaced by the tattered scarf. Zul'Jin stood to his full impressive height. He was easily a head and a half taller than the tallest troll she had seen, and walked down to the lower floor. Lorthamar had opened his eyes now, and seemed to be shaking off the visions, trying once again to get his bearings. She wondered about Galel. Looking over, she saw that his eyes were shut, but rather than struggling through some hideous dream state, he seemed to be in deep thought. He seemed to be contemplative rather than terrified. Liadrin wasn't sure whether to be worried about that or not.
And since we won't go away, I think we shall retake our land, burn your pretty buildings, send you running back the way you came. But it won't be easy. You'll be tricky.
He reached to his side and drew a 3-foot-long, wavy-bladed dagger.
Your rune stones make our magic weak. Your own magic be protecting your cities. But I been watching, and I been thinking.
Zul'Jin patted the point of the blade against his temple as he squatted down in front of Lorthamar now.
I think you get your power from that fountain of light. What you call it? The Sunwell. Yeah, I think it gives you power. Without it, maybe your magic not so great after all.
Liadrin turned to Darkhan. He was no longer a living corpse. He seemed to be fairly coherent. In fact, he seemed to be attentive. Zul'Jin used the dagger to slice off the leather straps holding Lorthamar's armor on. Next, he cut open the ranger's tunic, ripping the fabric from his exposed torso. Liadrin tried to wiggle a finger. No luck. She took in a deep breath, calmed herself as much as possible, and tried again. Success. It was just a minor motion, but at least it was something. It meant that the effects of the smoke were beginning to wear off. Zul'Jin traced the tip of the blade down Lorthamar's stomach and chest, barely brushing the surface of his skin.
I want to know how to overpower the rune stones. I want to know everything about that Sunwell and its defenses.
So, Liadrin thought, they do not know how to sabotage the runestones. It was, in fact, effective. At least that was something. He stood and looked toward Liadrin and the others.
Your friend here, maybe he don't talk. He be a ranger, no. They're tough breed. But you see him get skinned alive. Hear him scream till he got no breath left. Maybe one of you think twice. Maybe one of you talk. I give you a chance right now. One chance.
Zul'Jin looked first at Liadrin, then at Darkhan. He glanced quickly at Galel, whose eyes were still closed. There was a long moment of silence.
That be no surprise to me. You're too proud. Maybe you like the fighting and the killing. I tell you something. We're gonna fight till there be no more of us left to fight. You're gonna see what we be made of.
Eagerly fingering the tip of his blade, Zul'Jin squatted down inches away from Lorthamar.
But first I'm gonna open you up and see what you'll be made of. No!
Liadrin shouted.
Get away!
Her head spun to Darkhan, her eyes imploring him to take action. His own eyes shot to her, wide with fear. At that moment he looked very lost and completely helpless. He shook his head, signaling that his ability to cast had not yet returned. The dagger's tip pierced Lorthamar's skin just below the navel. Zul'Jin drew the blade down in a long, vertical slice.
It's not gonna be quick.
Liadrin immediately attempted to call upon the light to begin healing the wound, but the smoke still acted as a wall in her mind. As for Lorthamar, he did not cry out. He was intently focused on the task he had begun mere seconds before. He had regained a measure of mobility in his hands, and he worked now to coax out the miniature blade he carried under his belt in the small of his back. Blood flowed freely. Zul'Jin thrust his spindly fingers into the open wound. Lorthamar screamed. Liadrin looked at Galel, who had somehow managed to loosen the binding around his wrists. He reached up and worked on the ropes around his ankles. The two other trolls were so intent on the scene playing out with Lorthamar that they did not notice. Zul'jin rubbed Lorthamar's blood on the exposed sides of his own head. Galel worked free of the ropes, dropped onto the floor, and rolled to the side. He immediately stood and yanked a spear off the wall. The troll closest to his position turned. His eyes widened as he threw his own spear. Galel narrowly dodged the projectile as the troll reached for an axe in his belt. The young priest hesitated for a brief second, then bounded across the room, plunging the spear through the troll's neck and skewering his throat. The troll reached up and fumbled at the bloody, protruding spearhead as he struggled to breathe. He slumped backward as Galel stared for a moment, frozen. He watched the troll flail helplessly as his lifeblood coated the stone floor. He's never killed before, Liadrin thought. Zul'jin spun and lashed out with the wavy knife, the blade whistling through the air just inches from Galel's face. Galel stumbled back, slipping in the dying troll's blood. Lorthamar had retrieved the blade from his belt. He sliced at the ropes binding his wrists and painfully pulled himself up to work on his ankles. Galel swept up an axe from the fallen troll's belt. He bolted up and swung at Zul'jin, but the leader was too fast, lashing out and slashing the young priest's wrists. The axe dropped and clattered onto the stonework near Lorthamar. The scarred troll prepared to hurl his spear at Galel, but Zul'jin stepped in his path. Galel had backed up into one of the massive masks and dislodged it. Zul'jin charged forward, thrusting the dagger at as Galel grabbed the mask and swung up before him as a shield. The point of Zul'jin's dagger stuck in the wood. Galel drove forward. Lorthamar dropped to the floor, dizzy and lethargic from loss of blood. Liadrin struggled against her bonds as she felt that same tugging sensation in her core that she had felt earlier. She shot a glance at Darkon, who was hanging perfectly still, eyes closed. The sensation intensified for a brief second, then dissipated. But if the mage had regained his ability to focus, then perhaps... Liadrin closed her own eyes and reached out with her mind for the light. Zul'jin grabbed the mask and spun Galel, driving the young priest back against the wooden door, pinning him. He then unlimbered an axe from his belt and began hacking away large chunks of Galel's makeshift defense. The scarred troll jumped down onto the lower floor and stood over Lorthamar, spear raised above his head for the kill. Lorthamar rolled forward, reached behind his attacker's leg, and with the small blade he had used to free himself, severed the tendon just above the ankle. The scarred troll howled in pain and stumbled backward, falling onto the steps. The door behind Galel thundered against his back, rocked by blows from the opposite side, as the priest fought frantically to avoid Zul'jin's deadly axe. Liadrin felt the light's warm radiance at last, infusing her being as she focused all of the pain and horror she had felt in the past several minutes and redirected them into the mind of Zul'jin. Lorthamar grasped for the nearby fallen axe. His hand closed around the handle as he struggled to his knees. Zul'jin's relentless attack on Galel slowed. The warrior leader reeled as if in a daze, his free hand clutching his skull as he suffered a wave of pain, paranoia, and terror. But the repeated assaults from the opposite side of the door were quickly becoming too much for Galel to stand against. The young priest dropped the mask, turned, and put all his effort into bracing the door. Dark spots had now crept into the edges of Lorthamar's vision. He knew that his hold on consciousness was tenuous at best. He struggled to maintain focus as the scarred troll, unable to stand but unwilling to concede defeat, repositioned his prone body for a lunge. Liadrin saw that Lorthamar was in peril. She refocused her concentration, calling out to the light to heal the ranger, but her effort against Zul'jin had taken all of the mental acuity she could muster. She grew frustrated as her mind reached for the light and felt it slipping away, and the more frustrated she became, the more distant the light seemed. As the scarred troll thrust his spear at Lorthamar, a split second of panic gripped Liadrin, and her connection to the light was lost altogether. The troll lunged. With the spear tip just inches away, Lorthamar parried, shattering the shaft, shutting out the pain of the splintered wood impaling his shoulder. He brought the axe across in a backswing, nearly decapitating the troll. The creature clutched the flooding wound across his throat and rolled onto his side. Then a coaxing sensation pulled at Lorthamar's stomach. He looked at Darkon. Runnels of sweat poured down the mage's face. His eyes shut tight and teeth clenched, the veins in his neck and temples seeming on the verge of erupting from his skin. Zul'jin had now fully recovered from Liadrin's mental assault, yet he feigned debilitation for just a second more, calculating, carefully weighing his options. With an explosion of speed, he snatched Galel by the hair, yanking him away from the door and sweeping his legs from under him. The door burst open. Trolls poured in. 3 of them surrounded Lorthmar and raised spears. Zul'jin pushed Galel to his knees, tightened his grip on the priest's hair, and drew back his axe for the killing stroke. The tugging in Liadrin's gut increased until she felt her entire essence being ushered from this particular place in the world. Zul'jin swung the axe with all his might as Galel vanished, leaving the troll's free hand grasping only air as the blade sliced through tiny swirling particles of light. The troll leader turned, rage burning in his eyes as several more troll warriors flooded the room, but they were too late. The prisoners had escaped with like a teleportation spell. That's pretty good. So I don't know exactly when this to me feels. I mean, if Zul'jin is alive, this could be Warcraft 2 time. Could be Warcraft 1 time. Could be Warcraft 3. Yeah, it really could be any of them. Probably not later. But I liked it. That was a cool story. And yeah, I don't know why it's supposedly so far in the past. I feel like maybe it was a little bit in the past, but it was good. All right. Yeah, that's cool. We got another episode in the pipe, 5x5. I can't complain. That was, I don't know, but I enjoyed that one. And I thought that the troll dialogue, and we've seen it a bunch of times throughout this show, it's not always written well, at least in terms of helping me read it, but I thought that guy did a good job. All right, cool. Another episode in the pipe, 5x5. As always, I thank everybody so much for watching and for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. See everybody next time on Lore of Warcraft.